The letter he sent to the placement house in Chicago described what he needed in plain, functional terms. A woman who could cook and manage a household and assist with the books of a working cattle ranch in the hill country of central Texas. He specified that he had 200 acres under fence, a 4-room house, and no debt of consequence. He did not specify anything about temperament or disposition, which the matron of the placement house had noted in the margin of his letter with a small penciled question mark that would never be answered. What he received was Elsa Voss. She stepped off the southbound stage in Crail on a Tuesday in April, and Thomas Hurd was at the post when it arrived because he had calculated the day correctly and because he was the kind of man who met obligations at the appointed hour. He saw her before she saw him, which gave him a moment to form an impression that he would spend the next 2 years revising. She was younger than he had expected, mid-20s he guessed, with the particular self-contained quality of a person who has learned to read every room she enters before committing to any expression about it. She carried 2 bags. He noted the bags because they were the wrong bags for an orphan girl taking a placement on a working ranch. They were made of good leather, worn smooth with age and use, the kind of bags that were not bought new for a journey but had been someone's before they were hers. She looked at the street, at the stage post, at the men and women moving through the ordinary business of a Tuesday in a small town, and then she looked at him. He was standing at the post with his hat in his hand, which was not his usual habit, but which had seemed correct for the occasion. She walked to him directly. She said, "Mr. Hurd." He said, "Miss Voss." She looked at him, the way she had looked at the street, with the evaluating attention of someone building an assessment rather than forming a first impression. Then she said, "Shall we?" which was how it started. If this story finds you somewhere far from where it was written, leave your city in the comments. I want to know how far a thing like this travels. The ranch was 2 hours south of Crail by wagon, which gave them 2 hours of conversation that neither of them sought and neither of them avoided. Thomas Hurd was not a talkative man. He had been described by the county in general terms as capable and solitary and fair dealing, which were the 3 things the county considered most relevant about a man in his position, and which were accurate as far as they went. He was 41. He had built the ranch from a smaller parcel his father had left him, expanding it over 15 years through a series of purchases that had been methodical rather than ambitious, each one made when the numbers were right rather than when the opportunity appeared. He knew cattle. He did not particularly know what to do with a woman in his house, which was why he had written to the placement house and why he had been specific about the functional requirements and imprecise about everything else, which in retrospect was the kind of specification that told you more about what a person didn't know than what they did. Elsa Voss sat in the wagon and looked at the country as it changed from the small-town proximity of Crail to the open hill country south of it, and she asked 3 questions during the 2 hours, all of them practical. What the house's water source was, whether the ranch books were kept in a ledger system or loose accounts, what the primary cattle breed was. He answered all 3 and then looked at her and said, "Those are particular questions for a first conversation." She said, "I find out what I need to know first. The rest follows." He drove the wagon and thought about that for a while. When the house came into view over the last rise, she looked at it without changing her expression, which he noticed and which he understood later as neither disappointment nor approval, but simply reception, the face of someone who had learned to see what was actually in front of them before deciding what they thought about it. The house was 4 rooms as specified. It was also clean, which he had made sure of, and structurally sound, which it had always been. She looked at it for a moment, and then she got down from the wagon before he could assist her and picked up her bags and walked to the front door and went inside. He unhitched the horses and put them in the barn, and when he came back, she had already been through all 4 rooms and was standing in the kitchen, looking at the stove. "The damper on the left flue is sticking," she said. "I know," he said. "It's been sticking for 3 years." She looked at him. "Then we should fix it," she said, and went to look at the stove more closely. That was the first week. She fixed the damper herself on the third day, which he discovered when he came in from the south pasture at midday and found the kitchen warm in a way it hadn't been since the previous winter. A specific, even warmth that meant the flue was drawing correctly. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and said nothing, and then went to wash his hands. She said, from the stove where she was working, the left flue needed a new bracket. I took one from the outbuilding. He said, there was a spare bracket in the outbuilding? She said, there is now one fewer spare bracket in the outbuilding, which was the first time in the 2 years since his wife had died that something in the kitchen had made him come close to smiling. He did not smile. He washed his hands and sat down to eat. The books were the second week. She asked to see them on the first Saturday, and he brought them to the kitchen table and set them in front of her and watched her open the ledger and start from the beginning, which was 3 years back, and read forward with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. She read the whole ledger that afternoon. When she was done, she closed it and set it on the table and said, "You're recording the cattle sales correctly, but you're not tracking the pasture rotation costs against the yield by section. You're losing about 12% in unnecessary overgrazing losses." He looked at her. He said, "How do you know about pasture rotation costs?" She said, "My father managed a large cattle operation in Bavaria before we came to America. I kept his books from the time I was 14 until the year he died." He waited. "The placement house said you were an orphan." "I am now," she said, with a flatness that closed the subject the way a door closes when someone who knows where they are going passes through it. She did not explain what had happened between her father's death and the placement house in Chicago, and he did not ask, which was the first act of mutual respect between them, and the foundation on which everything else was built. She set up a new tracking system in the second week, a parallel ledger that cross-referenced each pasture section against its animal days of grazing, its recovery period, and its estimated carrying capacity by season. She had built the system from a format she knew from her father's records, modified for the specifics of Thomas's hill country operation, and she laid it out for him one evening at the kitchen table with the clean, assumption-free manner of someone explaining a tool rather than defending a decision. He looked at it. He said, "This is more detailed than what I've been keeping." "I know," she said. "The detail is the point." He studied the columns. She waited. He said, "How long to get the current operation onto this system?" She said, 2 weeks, if you give me an hour each evening to go through the section data with you." He said, "All right." They started the following evening. The hour became 2 hours most nights, and neither of them remarked on this. The county noticed her within the month, which was the county's habit with any new arrival, and which was particularly pronounced when the arrival was a woman at the Hurd place, because Thomas Hurd had been solitary long enough that his arrangement with the placement house had been discussed in the county for the full 3 weeks between when he sent the letter and when Elsa arrived. The assessment the county formed of Elsa Voss was quick and not entirely accurate. She was quiet in town, which they took for shyness. She was precise in her transactions, which they took for coldness. She was clearly managing Hurd's domestic arrangements with competence, which they had expected, and clearly also managing his books with something more than competence, which they had not. What the county did not know, and what Thomas Hurd did not know until the 6th week, was what was in the bags. The bags were the kind of thing you noticed and then stopped noticing because there was always something more immediate requiring attention. They sat in the room she used at the north end of the house, and their quality, the smooth, worn leather and the brass fittings that had been good fittings once and still were, was the kind of quality you filed away and didn't revisit. He revisited it in the 6th week because of a conversation with a man named Doyle who ran the county land office and who had come out to the ranch to discuss a boundary survey on the east section, and who, while waiting for Thomas to finish with the horses, had come inside and found Elsa at the kitchen table with the ledger and 2 other documents that were not the ledger, and that Doyle, who had spent 30 years reading land documents, recognized the format of immediately. He said nothing to Elsa. He went back outside and waited for Thomas. But when Thomas came in from the horses, Doyle said, before anything else was discussed, "The woman you've got doing your books, where did she say she was from?" Thomas said she was from Chicago by way of the placement house. Doyle looked at him. "Before Chicago," Doyle said. Thomas said Bavaria, which was as much as he knew. Doyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The documents on your kitchen table. There were two besides the ledger. One was a land assessment in German. The other was a letter of credit on a Frankfurt bank." He said it carefully, the way people say things they're not sure they should be saying. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "A letter of credit," Doyle said, "the kind that indicates a significant balance. I couldn't read the amount, but I've seen enough of that format to know the range it represents." He put his hat on. "I'll come back for the survey." He left. Thomas went into the house. Elsa was still at the kitchen table, the ledger open in front of her, the other documents nowhere in evidence. She looked up when he came in and read his face the way she read everything, which was completely and without haste. She said, "Doyle saw them." It was not a question. Thomas sat down across from her. He said, "He mentioned a letter of credit on a Frankfurt bank." She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the right-hand drawer of the kitchen table, which was where she kept the documents she used regularly, and took out a folded paper and put it on the table between them. It was a single sheet, dense with German text, with a bank seal at the bottom and two signatures. He could not read the German, but he could read numbers in any language, and the number in the second paragraph was not a number he had expected to see on his kitchen table. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at Elsa. He said, "Whose is this?" She said, "Mine." He waited. She said, "My father built his cattle operation over 40 years. When he died, there were debts and assets and a legal dispute with my uncle over the estate that took 3 years to resolve. When it resolved, the assets that were mine were transferred to a Frankfurt bank and I was given that letter." She looked at it on the table between them. "The amount is not what it was when the dispute began. 3 years of legal costs. But it is enough." Thomas said, "Enough for what?" She looked at him. "That depends on what you're asking." It was the most complicated sentence she had said to him in 6 weeks, and they both knew it. He looked at the letter of credit for another moment, and then he said, "Why the placement house?" She said, "Because I needed to be somewhere that was not Chicago and somewhere not in Germany, and I had enough information about Central Texas land values to know that this county had opportunity that the letter of credit could develop, and the placement house was the fastest way to get here with a reasonable explanation for arriving alone." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression she had worn at the stage post, the evaluating, unhurried look of a woman who has learned to be precise about what she wanted and patient about when she said it. He said, "You came here deliberately." "I came here with a purpose," she said. "Whether it was deliberate depends on how you define the word." He went to make coffee, which gave them both a moment, and she put the letter of credit back in the drawer and opened the ledger to the page she had been working and continued working, which he noted when he came back to the table with 2 cups, the specific quality of a person who does not let a significant conversation disrupt the work that was underway when the conversation began. He set her cup beside the ledger and sat down. He said, "What opportunity?" She said, "The east section of your property, the section with the survey question. There is a water source on the land that adjoins it to the east, a spring-fed draw that the current owner, a man named Caswell, has not developed because he runs goats and doesn't need water infrastructure. If your east boundary survey confirms the line is where I believe it is based on the county records, and if Caswell can be persuaded to sell his parcel or lease the draw access, the combined water rights would support a herd 3 times your current size on the existing acreage." Thomas looked at her. She had been reading the county land records. He had not known this. The county land office was in town, and she went to town for provisions on Fridays, and the county land office was apparently also on her Friday schedule in a way she had not mentioned. He said, "You've been reading the county records." she said. The county records are public. They are, he said. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, the April evening was moving toward dark over the hill country, in the long, slow way of evenings that have space to take their time, the light going from gold to amber, to something that was almost purple before it gave up entirely and let the dark have the hills. He said, the Caswell parcel, he'd sell. He wants to sell, Elsa said. His operation is not working. He's been trying to sell for 2 years, and nobody has offered him what it's worth, because the county doesn't see the water resource the way I see it. How do you see it? Thomas said. She said, as the thing that makes this ranch into a different kind of operation. He said, how different? She said, different enough that the letter of credit in that drawer becomes an investment rather than a reserve. He looked at the drawer. He looked at her. He said, you came here with a plan. I came here with an observation, she said. The plan develops from the observation. It was the most honest description of how she thought that she had given him, and he recognized it because it was how he thought too, and the recognition was a specific thing, not comfortable exactly, but solid, the feeling of a foundation that has been there the whole time, and that you have just put your weight on for the first time. He said, what would you need? She told him, the East Section survey first, then the conversation with Caswell, which she said she would handle herself if he would allow it, because she had been in correspondence with Caswell already and had a clearer picture of what he would accept than a first meeting would produce. Then a meeting with the bank in Crail about a loan structure that would allow the letter of credit to remain in the Frankfurt Bank and earn while the operation expanded. He listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions. She answered them with the specificity of someone who had thought about the objections before they were raised. When she was done, he said, how long have you been planning this? She said, since I read your letter to the placement house. He said, that letter was about a cook and a bookkeeper. She said, your letter was about a man who had 200 acres, no debt, good cattle, and a water problem he hadn't solved yet. She closed the ledger. I can cook. I can keep books. Those things were true, and they were useful to you. But I did not travel from Chicago to Central Texas to cook and keep books. He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was quiet, in the particular way kitchens are quiet in the evenings, when the fire is low, and the day's work is done, and the next day's work hasn't started yet. Then he said, what did you travel from Chicago to Central Texas to do? She said, build something. He was quiet. Outside, the dark had taken the hills completely, and the first stars were in the part of the sky visible through the kitchen window, cold and specific and unconcerned with the conversation happening below them. He said, the Caswell parcel, what are you thinking for the approach? She opened the ledger again and turned to the page in the back where she had been keeping her notes on the Caswell situation since February, 3 months of correspondence and observation laid out in her careful hand, and she set it on the table between them so they could both read it. He pulled his chair around to her side of the table. She moved the lamp. They looked at the notes together. The survey took 3 weeks and confirmed the east boundary line at the coordinates Elsa had calculated from the county records, which put the spring-fed draw on Caswell's side of the line, but within a distance that made access negotiable in a way it would not have been if the boundary had fallen differently. Thomas rode out to look at the draw the day after the survey results came in. Elsa came with him, which he had not suggested and she had not asked about, simply appearing at the barn with her boots on when he was saddling the horses, and he had handed her the reins of the bay without comment. They rode the east section together and then crossed the boundary line and found the draw in the mid-morning light, a spring-fed seam in the hillside, with a good flow and clean water, and the evidence of being used by Caswell's goats, but not developed. No infrastructure, no holding tank, just the raw water emerging from the rock and running down into a small gravel-bottom channel that disappeared into the brush below. Elsa got down and walked to the spring and crouched at it and put her hand in the water and held it there for a moment. Thomas watched her from the horse. She said, The flow rate is better than I estimated from the survey description. She stood up and dried her hand on her coat. This is enough for what we need. He looked at the spring and at the draw and at the surrounding land, which was Caswell's land, and which showed the unmistakable signs of an operation that had been run without adequate capital for long enough that the maintenance had started falling behind the need. The fences were the kind of fences that have been repaired so many times that the repairs are what hold them up. The outbuildings in the distance were sound but unpainted, and the corrals needed work. He said, "Caswell's been holding on. He's been holding on for 4 years," Elsa said. "His wife wants to go to her family in Arkansas. He wants to go. The operation is what's keeping him here." She looked at the spring. "He doesn't need money as much as he needs a reason to leave without feeling like he failed." Thomas looked at her. She said, "There's a difference between buying a man's land and buying a man's land in a way that lets him keep his self-regard." He thought about this. It was the kind of distinction he would have arrived at himself eventually, through trial and negotiation, but which she had arrived at in advance, through observation, which was faster and less costly. He said, "How do you propose we approach it?" She said, "I write to him first. We've been corresponding. He trusts the correspondence. Then we go together, and you let me lead the conversation until there's something that requires your signature." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same expression she had worn in the placement house letter, in Crail, at the kitchen table, at the spring. The expression of a woman who had arrived at a conclusion through a reliable process and was prepared to act on it. He said, "All right." The meeting with Caswell happened on a Thursday in May, on his porch, with his wife visible in the kitchen window behind him and the goats moving through the near pasture in the unhurried way of animals that have gotten used to not having enough space. Caswell was a decent man in a position that had been eroding for long enough that the erosion had started to look like character. He shook Thomas's hand and nodded to Elsa and waited to see how the conversation would develop. Elsa opened it. She described what they were proposing, not as a purchase exactly, but as an arrangement that would give Caswell what the land was worth rather than what the county currently thought it was worth, which were 2 different numbers, and which would be structured so that the payment was clear and final and included the spring-fed draw access in a way that was documented rather than assumed. She said this with the clean, unhurried manner of someone stating facts about something she understood well, and Caswell listened the way people listen when what they are hearing is close to what they had hoped but were not certain they would be offered. His wife had come to the kitchen doorway. Thomas noticed this. Elsa apparently noticed it too, because she said, without turning from Caswell, "Mrs. Caswell, you should hear this directly. The terms affect you both equally." There was a pause. Mrs. Caswell came out of the kitchen and stood beside her husband and listened to the rest of what Elsa said, which took another 10 minutes and which was, Thomas thought, the most precise and respectful description of a financial arrangement he had ever heard delivered on a front porch in his life. When she finished, Caswell looked at his wife. His wife looked at him. Then Caswell said, "I'd want the figure in writing before I agreed." Elsa took a folded paper from her coat pocket and put it on the porch railing. He had not known she had brought a written summary. She had not mentioned it on the ride over. He filed this away and said nothing. Caswell read the paper. He read it twice. He handed it to his wife. She read it. She looked at Elsa. She said, "The figure on the second line, the additional sum for the draw access agreement." Elsa said, "The draw access is worth more than the parcel without it. The additional sum reflects that." Mrs. Caswell looked at her husband. He looked at the hills beyond the fence and at the spring-fed draw that he had owned for 8 years and not developed, and at the operation that had been slowly outpacing his ability to sustain it for 4 of those years. He said, "We'd want 60 days to move." Elsa said, 90 is acceptable if you need it." He looked at her. He looked at Thomas. Thomas had said almost nothing in the entirety of the conversation, which was what Elsa had asked, and which had turned out to be the correct thing. because Thomas's silence had read as patience rather than indifference, and Caswell was the kind of man who would have stiffened at a buyer who pushed. Caswell put his hand out and Thomas shook it, and Mrs. Caswell went back inside, and Elsa put the paper back in her coat pocket, and they rode home in the afternoon light, with the Caswell parcel behind them, and the spring-fed draw, and all the water it represented, and all the additional carrying capacity that followed from the water. And neither of them said much on the ride, because there was not much to say yet. The agreement was made, but the work was ahead, and they were both people who lived in the work rather than in the discussion of the work. The loan from the Crail Bank was the hardest part of the spring, not because the banker was hostile, but because he was cautious, in the particular way of a man who has extended credit to operations that looked sound and found out later they weren't, and who needed to be shown the specific mechanism of why this situation was different before he could say yes, with the confidence that made the yes useful. Elsa handled this meeting differently than the Caswell meeting. She brought the full ledger, both the old system and the new one she had built, and she brought the pasture rotation records she had been keeping since March, and she brought the spring survey results and a map she had drawn of the water infrastructure she intended to build from the draw across the eastern section. She put all of it on the banker's table and let him look. He looked for a long time. He asked 4 questions, all of them technical, and she answered them all, and then said, "The letter of credit in the Frankfurt Bank is not part of the security we're offering. We're offering the ranch's existing assets and the Caswell parcel as security. The Frankfurt account is separate." He looked at her. "Why tell me about it if it's not part of the security?" She said, "Because it indicates that we are not asking you to be the backstop. We are asking you to be a participant in an operation that already has its own reserve. That is a different kind of loan to make." He looked at the ledger and the map and the survey results and the pasture records. He said, 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, he said yes. The water infrastructure took the rest of the summer. Thomas designed it and built most of it himself, with one hired man named Garrett, who worked with the focused competence of someone who had built water systems before, and who understood that the quality of the work in the first section determined everything that came after it. Elsa came out to the build site most evenings, not to supervise but to document, walking the sections with her notebook and recording what was completed and what remained and what had changed from the original plan, because plans for water infrastructure in hill country always changed from the original plan, and the changes needed to be in writing before they became assumptions. By September, the draw was connected to a holding tank on the east slope, and from the tank to a distribution system that ran along the eastern fence line and fed 3 new watering points in the section that had been dry-ranged 2 seasons ago. Thomas brought the first group of additional cattle through the east section gate on a Monday morning in October and watched them find the water with the particular, matter-of-fact efficiency of animals who have been moved to a new pasture and are conducting the practical assessment of what it offers. He stood at the fence for a while. Garrett was putting the last posts in on the south section of the new fence line, the sound of the mallet carrying across the pasture in the clear October air. Elsa was at the house. He knew she was at the house because she was there most mornings at this hour, at the kitchen table with the ledger, recording the previous day's figures and planning the current day's work in the methodical way she did everything. He came back to the house at midday and she was still at the table, the ledger open, a second document beside it that he recognized as the Caswell purchase agreement, which she kept in the right-hand drawer and consulted when she needed to reference the draw access terms. He poured coffee and sat across from her. She said, without looking up, "The October figures are going to look different from September." He said, "I know." She said, "Different good." He said, "I know that too." She finished the column she was working on and closed the ledger and looked at him with the evaluating expression that had been her first expression and that had not changed in the 6 months since April, except that it now had a context behind it. 6 months of mornings at the kitchen table, and evenings with the ledger, and a Caswell negotiation, and a bank meeting, and a summer of water infrastructure, and the context made it a different expression without changing its surface, The way ground looks the same after rain, but holds differently underfoot. She said, "There's a property on the North Road that Doyle mentioned." He looked at her. "When did you talk to Doyle?" She said, "Last Friday." He said, "What's on the North Road?" She said, "A parcel with an existing orchard and a soil profile that suggests it was used for grain before the current owner switched to cattle, which is not what the soil is suited for." She folded her hands on the table. "If the land is being misused, the price reflects that." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "The Frankfurt account," she said, "is still there." He said, "I know it's still there. I'm asking whether this is what you want to use it for." She looked at him in the particular way she had been looking at him since the evening of the letter of credit, which was the honest, level look of a person who has decided that a conversation they have been building toward is now the right conversation to have. She said, "What I want to use it for is what we build together. That's been true since I read your letter in Chicago and understood what this place could be." He looked at his coffee. He looked at the ledger on the table, and the Caswell agreement, and the notebook she kept beside it, and the 2 leather bags that were still in the room at the north end of the house. The bags that had first told him something was different about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Crail, something he hadn't had language for yet. He said, "You plan to build something." She said, "I plan to find somewhere worth building." He said, "And you did." She said, "We did." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Outside, Garrett's mallet was still carrying across the pasture, steady and deliberate, each post set correctly because the one before it had been set correctly, the fence running east toward the draw, and the new water and the additional cattle moving through the October grass in the particular, settled way of animals that have found their place in a working operation and have started behaving accordingly. He said, "Tell me about the North Road parcel," she told him. He listened the way he had been listening since April, which was the way he listened to things that mattered, which was completely and without interruption, understanding by the middle of her description that this was going to be what she thought it was going to be, which was the beginning of the next thing, built on what they had already built, solid in the way that things are solid when they are built by people who understand both the ground beneath them and each other. The North Road parcel belonged to a man named Birch, who had come to the county 8 years ago with ambitions that the land had politely declined to support. He was not a bad farmer. He was a farmer who had made one foundational error, which was choosing cattle for soil that had been grain soil for 2 generations before him and that had the mineral profile and drainage characteristics of grain soil, and that was growing mediocre cattle on ground that would have grown excellent wheat, and which was selling at mediocre cattle ranch prices when it should have been selling at grain-capable agricultural land prices. Elsa had identified this from the county soil survey records, which she had read at the land office on 3 consecutive Fridays in the fall. Doyle, the land office manager, had initially handed her the survey volumes with the polite uncertainty of a man not sure what she intended to do with them, and had come to understand, over the course of 3 Fridays, that she intended to read them, all of them, and had thereafter simply set the volumes on the counter when she arrived without waiting to be asked. She had not discussed the North Road parcel with Thomas until she had read everything relevant to it, because presenting an incomplete case was the kind of inefficiency she had learned to avoid in her father's office, where the cost of an incomplete case was measured in legal fees and time. The case she presented to Thomas in October was complete. She went to see Birch herself in November, which Thomas had not suggested and she had not asked permission for, because the correspondence she had with Birch over 3 months of letters had established a specific kind of trust that a joint visit would have disrupted. She rode out on a Friday morning and came back in the late afternoon with a verbal agreement on terms that were below the property's corrected value but above what Birch had been expecting, which was the precise zone in which a transaction could happen without either side feeling they had been managed. She told Thomas the terms at the kitchen table that evening. He said, "You went alone." She said, "I went on a Friday. You were in the south pasture." He looked at her with the expression he had been developing since April, which was the expression of a man who has been surprised by someone with some regularity, and has stopped being surprised by the surprise, and now simply receives it as information. He said, "What are the terms?" She told him. He listened. He said, "The figure is low for that acreage." She said, "The figure is fair for the use he's been putting it to. The figure for the use we intend to put it to is different, but that's not his problem to price." He said, "And the grain operation, you're planning to return it to grain." She said, "I'm planning to return a portion of it to grain and maintain the remainder as integrated pasture, which is the management approach my father used in Bavaria on similar soil structure. The income from the grain offsets the pasture-carrying costs in poor cattle years." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've been planning this since you read the soil surveys." She said, "I've been thinking about it since I read the soil surveys. Planning requires a partner." He looked at her. It was the clearest thing she had said about the nature of what they were doing. Not the parcels or the ledger or the water infrastructure, but the underlying structure of it, which was two people who had been building something together since April and who had arrived at October in a different position than either of them had specified when the letter went to the placement house and the wagon came to Crail. He said, "I'll look at the terms tomorrow, and we'll decide together." She nodded. She opened the ledger to the current page. He got up and poured more coffee, and came back and sat beside her at the table, rather than across from it, which was where he had been sitting since the evening of the letter of credit. And they looked at the figures together in the lamplight, the way they looked at everything that mattered, which was carefully and without rushing, and with the full understanding that the figures in front of them were the record of work already done and the foundation of work yet to come. The birch parcel completed in January. The winter was cold that year, the kind of cold that makes the hill country look like a different place. The grasses gone pale, and the draws frozen at the edges, and the sky, the particular flat gray of a season that has decided to take its time. The cattle managed it. The water infrastructure in the east section held. The holding tank insulated with the baled hay Elsa had thought to specify in September, which Thomas had noted and filed away as the specific kind of preparation that saves you from an emergency you never have because you prepared for it. She began the soil remediation work on the birch parcel in February, which was earlier than Thomas had expected, and which she accomplished by hiring 2 men from the county who understood grain farming and who came recommended by a farmer she had corresponded with in the neighboring county, a woman named Adele, who had been running a mixed grain and cattle operation for 12 years and who had written back to Elsa's inquiry with 3 pages of specific, unsentimental advice about soil transition timelines and what to expect in the first growing season and what not to expect until the third. The correspondence with Adele had been ongoing since November. Thomas had not known about it until February, when Elsa showed him the letters because they had become relevant to the planting schedule. He read them and looked up and said, "You've been in correspondence with a grain farmer since November." She said, "Since October." The first letter took a month to get a response. He read the letters again. He said, "She knows what she's doing." "Yes," Elsa said, "I don't write to people who don't." Which was true, and which he had understood about her since the first week, when she had trimmed the damper bracket from a spare in the outbuilding before he had thought to look for the part. The spring planting on the birch parcel went in March. The grain seed Adele had recommended for the soil type worked into the remediated earth by the 2 men Elsa had hired and overseen herself, walking the rows in the cold early spring mornings with her notebook and recording what was done and what remained and what the soil texture told her about how the winter remediation had worked. Thomas came out 2 Saturdays in a row and walked the rows with her without being asked, and on the second Saturday he said, looking at the turned earth, "Your father's operation, what did he grow?" She said, "Barley primarily, some wheat, a grain he called dinkel, that I haven't found seed for here." She looked at the field. He had a feeling for land. for what it was capable of beyond what it was currently doing. She paused. I think about that when I'm reading soil surveys. Thomas looked at the field. He said, "It runs in the family." She looked at him. He looked back at her. It was a simple statement, and they both understood what it contained, which was not a compliment exactly, but a recognition, the specific recognition of one person who reads land accurately for another, which was worth more in that county on that March morning than most things that could have been said. The county, for its part, had continued to update its assessment of Elsa Voss through the autumn and winter, as information became available, which was the county's natural process with any new element, and which in her case was producing revisions of increasing magnitude. The first revision had been when the Caswell parcel transferred, because everyone in the county knew Caswell had been trying to sell for 2 years and that the price he'd gotten was not the price the county had thought the parcel was worth. The second revision had been when the east section water infrastructure became visible from the county road, because water infrastructure of that quality in that location told a story about planning that the county could read even without knowing the details. The third revision, in February, was Doyle telling his wife that the woman at the Hurd place had read every volume of the county soil survey, and his wife telling 2 other women, and the information moving from there in the way information moves in small counties, which is thoroughly and not always accurately, but in this case accurately enough. By March, the county's assessment had arrived at something close to the truth, which was that Thomas Hurd had written to a placement house for a cook and a bookkeeper and had received something considerably more complex, which was operating in his favor in ways that were becoming visible to anyone who paid attention to the east section and the Caswell parcel and the Birch parcel and the ledger entries that Doyle had glimpsed and that were now, he understood, the most detailed ranch records in the county. Thomas heard a version of this assessment from a man at the feed store in April, a year after Elsa had arrived on the stage. The man said, in the imprecise way of county assessments relayed secondhand, "Heard your placement house woman turned out to be something other than expected." Thomas considered this for a moment. He said, "She turned out to be exactly what she was. We were just imprecise about what we were asking for." He paid for the feed and loaded the wagon and drove south toward the ranch, which was a different ranch than it had been a year ago, which was the point. The east section was running at full capacity. The Birch parcel was planted and coming up in the rows that the 2 men had worked in the cold and that Adele's advice had shaped and that Elsa's soil survey reading had identified as possible before anyone had spent $1 on a seed. The spring-fed draw was running clear from the winter snowmelt and the holding tank was full, and the distribution system was working the way Garrett had built it to work, which was correctly, because Garrett was the kind of man who built things correctly the first time. Elsa was at the kitchen table when he came in, which was where she usually was in the morning, and which he had stopped noticing as a fact and had started understanding as a condition of the place. The way the stove and the lamp and the ledger on the table were conditions of the place, things that were there when he came in, and that defined the room not by being noteworthy, but by being correct. She looked up when he came in. She said, "How was town?" He said, "Informative." She said, "The county has opinions about us." He said, "The county has opinions about everything." She said, "Are the opinions wrong?" He thought about this for a moment. He hung his hat on the hook by the door, the hook she had asked him to move 3 inches to the left in the first week because the original position required an awkward reach that accumulated into a small annoyance over time. And he thought about the letter he had sent to the Chicago placement house and what he had written in it, and what he had meant when he wrote it, and what he had received instead, and whether received was the right word for something that had been chosen as specifically as the county soil surveys, and the Caswell correspondence, and the terms on the Birch parcel, and the water system, and the ledger that was now on its 3rd volume. He said, "The county's opinions are imprecise, but not wrong." She looked at him. He sat down across from her, and she poured coffee from the pot on the stove and set it in front of him, and they sat in the morning kitchen, with the April light coming through the east window, and the ledger between them, and the sound of the cattle in the east section, carrying faintly on the spring air, and none of it was what either of them had written to the placement house about. And all of it was exactly what both of them had been building toward since the stage came in from the north on a Tuesday in April, and a woman with 2 leather bags stepped down and looked at the street, and then looked at the man with his hat in his hand and said simply, without preamble or ceremony or any indication of the full scope of what she had already decided, "Shall we?" The grain came up in May, which was when it was supposed to come up, and which was also, as Adele had predicted in her first letter, a tentative emergence, the first season's growth being more about establishing root structure than producing at the level the soil would eventually support. Elsa had read this in Adele's letter and had told Thomas and had incorporated it into the financial projections so that the first year's grain yield was not the year the numbers needed to work, which was planning of the kind that protected you from the disappointment of a correct process that simply needed more time than you wanted it to. She walked the grain rows on a morning in late May with her notebook and Thomas beside her, and noted what was there and what was not yet there and what would be different in the second year. And when she was done writing, she stood at the edge of the field and looked at it for a moment, the pale green of the new growth coming up through the turned soil in the morning light, tentative and particular, and already telling her things about the land that the soil survey had predicted and that she was now seeing confirmed, which was always the moment she found most useful, not the idea and not the completion, but the early evidence that the idea was correct, the first indication that what you had read in the data was also what the land intended to do. Thomas stood beside her. He looked at the grain and at the hills beyond it, and at the east section where the cattle were moving in the morning light, and at the draw that was not visible from here, but that he knew was there, running clean from the winter's snowmelt through the infrastructure that had taken a summer to build. He said, "Your father's operation in Bavaria, was it larger than this?" She considered the question. She said, "Larger in acres, not larger in what it was." He looked at her. She said, "He built it to last." That was the thing he was most careful about, not the size, the structure of it. He used to say that any operation that could not survive a bad year was not yet an operation. She looked at the grain. He survived 4 bad years in a row once, in the 1860s. By the 5th year, the operation was stronger than it had been before the 4 years started. Thomas said, "What was different about year 5? She said, he had learned 4 years' worth of what could go wrong, which meant he had built in the answers before the questions came again. He looked at the grain coming up in the May light. He said, "The Frankfurt account. When did your father open it?" She said, "The year after the 4 bad years." He said a reserve was not a comfort. It was a tool. The difference between an operation that can absorb a problem and one that cannot is usually a question of whether the reserve exists. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He said, "He sounds like someone worth listening to." She said, "He was." She closed the notebook. "That's why I read everything he wrote down." They walked back toward the house in the May morning, the grain field behind them, and the cattle visible across the east section fence, and the house ahead, with the smoke coming from the kitchen stove, where the fire was low but still working. The way all working things are still working when you come back to them. Reliable, in the way that things are reliable when they have been built correctly and maintained with the daily attention that reliability requires. She went ahead to start the morning work, and he stopped at the barn to check the horses, and when he came into the kitchen, she had the ledger open and the coffee on, and the current figures already in the column where the current figures went. And he sat down across from her, and she slid the ledger to the center of the table so they could both see it, and he looked at the numbers, which were the numbers of an operation that was growing in the specific, documented, methodical way that operations grow when they are built on the correct foundations. And he thought about a letter he had written to a placement house in Chicago describing what he needed, which had been imprecise about most things and precise about none of the things that turned out to matter. and about a woman who had read that letter and understood it better than he had written it, and had come south on the stage with 2 leather bags and a letter of credit and a plan she had been building since the day she read the soil surveys in the county land office, and who had walked off the stage in Crail on a Tuesday in April and said simply, to a man she had never met and had already decided to work with, "Shall we?" He looked at her across the ledger. She was writing in the column without looking up, the same way she wrote everything, which was with full attention and without performance. And he thought that the placement house in Chicago had done something that the placement house in Chicago had probably not known it was doing, which was sending him exactly the right person and not at all the person described in the letter, which was the kind of outcome that made you think carefully about the difference between what you asked for and what you actually needed, and whether those 2 things were ever as close as you thought they were when you were writing the letter. They were not close. The difference between them was everything that had happened since April. He picked up his pen and started on the figures for the east section, the column beside hers, the way it had been for a year now, 2 people working the same ledger on the same table in the same kitchen, building the same thing from the same foundation, which was the foundation that had been there since she said, "Shall we?" and he had understood, in the fraction of a second before he answered, that she was not asking about the wagon ride to the ranch.